Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Dolan. I'm the creator of LuckyCast.com, and this talk is about embracing Ruby and building on the shoulders of giants. It's funny because when I submitted this talk, I actually didn't know that Mats was going to be giving the very first talk of the day. So, talk about building on the shoulders of giants. I definitely feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants for this talk. It was great to hear Matt's thoughts on the language and everything. And just before I get too far into it, I want to give a quick shout out to the moderators and organizers that have been on the conference and on our chat in the speakers channel all day. This is only my second only conference talk ever. And like Martin was saying, my first one was actually just 4 hours ago in the same track. But I've been really impressed with how well it's gone. So please make sure that you show them some love in Discord for everything they do. Great. Well, I'll start with a bit about me. Like I said, I'm Steven. I'm on the core team of the Lucky Web Framework for about a year now. And that's actually what my previous talk was about, is what made me fall in love with Lucky through their unique approach to how you write HTML in the framework. So if you're interested in that, definitely go and give that talk a listen when the VOD is posted. My wife and I have a dog named Coda. She's the little fluffy, cute thing to the right of that picture there. And in my free time, I do a lot of home improvement projects that I probably should legally be requiring contractors to do, but decide to try my luck and most of the time end up working out okay. And I'm also the creator of Lucky Casts, which is just another way of building on the shoulders of the giants that came before this Crystal community that we all love and participate in so readily. I benefited in a massive way when I was coming online with Ruby and Rails through what Ryan Bates and Chris Oliver had done. Railscast was there wasn't a lot of new content being posted when I joined the community, and Chris Oliver was kind of taking up that mantle and has really become a role model for me and how to build a community and create educational content, how to talk in the public sphere and make people feel welcome and encourage them to contribute. So a lot of what I'm doing with Lucky Casts is just because I didn't see a resource like that in the Lucky community when I came online and decided to build it. So like I mentioned, I came to Crystal from a Ruby and Rails background. And it's funny because there are some of those memories that when you think back, you have like sounds and smells and sights that you can just remember, these like keystone memories. You listen to a song and you can remember, walking down a trail and seeing the trees blow in the wind. For me, it's funny, but I actually have one of those for when I decided I was going to try Crystal. I had spent like a half a day on this internal Rails app at the company I work at. I don't program as my day job. I'm more of a people manager, but I do programming as a hobby and kind of as a solopreneur. And I had spent like 4 hours working on this Google Calendar integration where I wanted to take time off adjustments that employees were submitting and sync them to a Google Calendar. I was feeling really good about it. I had done some TDD as I went. I was writing pretty decent code. At least, me at that time thought it was pretty decent code. And I had my PR up, CI had passed, I merged it, and I swear within 5 minutes, my roll bar errors were just full of the infamous undefined method for nil. I mean, it wasn't exactly these errors, but you can see from the view counts on Stack Overflow, this happens quite a lot to a lot of people, and it can be really confusing. And I was deflated. I knew what it meant. It meant that I hadn't thought that a nil was nil when it was nil. And I knew that to fix that and to find where it was and to write a test that covered it, I was probably going to have to spend the next day just as much time as it had taken me to originally write the feature. So I was just feeling really deflated. I thought, okay, I'll come back to that tomorrow. And I remember this memory starts, I'm on the interstate and I was pulling off on the exit ramp and I was listening to an episode of the Bike Shed podcast, and they were interviewing this guy named Paul Smith and talking about this cool web framework he had created called Lucky and this cool language he was using called Crystal. And I remember right as the street light was turning yellow, the stoplight was turning yellow, I remember Paul and the host talking about how annoying undefined method for nil was and how Crystal could help find those and you didn't have to worry about them anymore. So I was sold. After that day that I had and that production deployment, I was all in. I was like, let's go. I'm going to try Crystal. I'm going to go try this Lucky thing and see how it is to build web apps. So as soon as I got back home, I got Crystal installed and I was looking through the Lucky docs and I was just enamored with the way it handled HTML pages. So I thought, okay, this is the path. I'm going to see how it works. So I started putting together my first sample app. And for me, the way that my brain works, for some reason, writing a hello world just isn't really good enough for me to figure out how something works or whether I like it. I've really got to bring a lot of the background tools and knowledge that I have with me and make it feel like home. And I think that a lot of developers are like this. As a web developer, especially, we have so many ancillary tools and libraries that we use that you have this kind of toolbox you accumulate over time. And a critical part of adding a new tool to your toolbox is how well it's going to play with the rest of the tools. So when I picked up Lucky, I first wanted to know if it could support all the stuff that I know and love working with that had kept me productive so far. And unfortunately, it was a lot harder than I had expected. The Lucky community is probably one of the most welcoming and lovely places that I have ever had the privilege of being involved with. I mean, no one is ever going to insult you for asking a question, but I had a little bit of, imposter syndrome thinking, oh my gosh, how can I not get TypeScript installed? I don't even want to ask the question or ask these, members of the core team to help me or hop on a screen share. I was too embarrassed. And it was even more frustrating mentally because I had felt like that problem was solved in Rails. It was never something I'd had to deal with because if I want to install Tailwind, I throw that into a browser search and I'm going to see Go Rails videos on how to install Tailwind, probably every version that's existed. I'm going to see 20 different blog posts for how to install Tailwind in Rails. There's just so much more content available because the community is so much more established, and we'll get there in Crystal, but it just wasn't there when I was coming online. And then additionally in the Rails community, as if he weren't doing enough, Chris Oliver, outside of creating Go Rails, created this site called railsbytes.com that had made it was just so much easier for me to get started with tools that I hadn't used before. So this is a screenshot from the site, and it's basically a repository of Ruby scripts at its core. That's all it is. But these scripts are valid Thor scripts, which is a gem in Ruby. And that gem can modify your local project by doing things like injecting content into files, or printing messages to users, or asking them questions, or prepending content, or creating directories, or installing gems. It can do a ton of stuff. It was really cool. And to look at an example, let's look at Tailwind CSS. So here's what it looks like in railsbytes.com. And don't worry if the font's a little bit small. We're going to look at a code sample a little bit later, much bigger. But this is basically how it works. You would find whatever you want to install in Rails, and you'd run Rails app:template, and then set this environment variable location to wherever the script resided. And it was so cool because if I didn't know how it worked, I didn't really have to. You always scan remote code that you're executing to make sure it's not malicious. But outside of that, I could kind of just trust that, okay, they're importing those 3 packages. I'm going to import those 3 packages. And as long as it worked in the end result, I didn't really ask questions. I had Tailwind up and running and I could dig into the details later. I could start building my feature that I wanted to build. So Rails takes this script, runs it through this gem called Thor using a method called apply. And you'll find that with most of the scripts on Rails bytes, whether it's Tailwind or Stimulus or Honey Badger or Sentry or any other one, there's really only 2 components. First, you have to get whatever you're trying to set up installed. Then you have to modify a bunch of files. Sometimes you have to insert content or delete content or modify content, but those are the 2 basic stages. It's just not that complex. So you're using very little of what Thor can actually do anyways. So I had my ideal. This is what I wanted in the Lucky and Crystal community. And I had my idea. I had this idea that any sane person with a 9-to-5 who programs in their spare time would have. All I needed to do to get this working was, 1, recreate Rails app template command in the Lucky CLI. 2, I needed to rewrite the Thor gem as a crystal shard from scratch, and I would own the repository. And then 3rd, I needed to make a site that was just like railsbytes.com, basically identical, but for Crystal and Lucky apps. And I got about 20 minutes into creating repositories for all of these things and getting really excited, and your brain starts spinning around all the things you're going to improve and how you're going to structure your issue templates. And then I realized how unattainable and unnecessary that ultimately was. Instead, I could just build on the systems that I know and love already and extend them to be more general use. Really, the only thing that was lacking from all the stuff that I just showed you was that I had to run it within the context of a Rails app, and I couldn't run it in my Lucky directory. As developers, I think we walk this tightrope balancing act where we have both an intense yearning to understand what we're using and how things are built, and also a necessity to build to generate value, whether it's for our employers or our clients or ourselves and our families. There are some cases where reinventing the wheel is a good thing. It helps you understand how the wheel works. You can iterate on it and renovate and make it better than it was before. But there are often even more cases where we can either enhance or build alongside a tool that someone else has already put the time and work into. They already care about it. They already maybe have a community built around it, like with Rails Bytes. So I found myself in the second of those two scenarios when I started examining what I was actually doing. So instead of doing all of that, I spent maybe an afternoon researching how it worked on the back end and writing these 22 lines of code. So instead of a multi-month effort that I would have had to maintain indefinitely, I was able to produce this command line client called bloat. You can get it at stephendolan.com/bloat or gem install bloat. And how it works is you pass it a URL and it's going to execute that URL's script in the context of Thor using this apply call on line 19 in any directory on your machine. It doesn't have to be in Rails. It can be in a Lucky app. It can be in an Amber app, a Kamal app, in a command line app. It can be anywhere. So instead of spending all this time that I would have had to spend building up all of the infrastructure to support this in Crystal from the ground up, I was able to spend my time creating LuckyCast videos showing how to install things like Tailwind. And one of the pet peeves that I had always had with installation videos is I felt like people would spend the first 20 minutes of a video talking about how you install something, which commands you run, which files you open. And I always found it really annoying because by the time I would get to those videos, it seemed like they were somehow always out of date. So this is sort of like infrastructure as code and why that's so beautiful and makes a lot of sense to people. Because you don't want to have to be setting up your server by hand every time you deploy. Similarly, if you're standing up a lot of apps, you don't want to have to remember how to install Tailwind CSS and Instant Page and Fathom Analytics and Sentry IO and setting up TypeScript. It's stuff that you don't need to store in your head. So you can store this kind of process as code in a place like Rails Bytes. And I was able to document how these things were done so that it would support not only me as I build, LuckyCast videos, I can come here and set up any amount of functionality I need very quickly, but also newcomers to the community so that they can come here and install anything that they need for their apps. So if you wanted to install Tailwind CSS in a Lucky application today, the first step would be to install this gem globally so that you can execute it in that application's context with gem install bloat. Obviously, you could have a gem file in your application directory. That works too, but I find that it works well just to globally install it. And then you bloat with whatever the Rails byte URL is. So the name of the gem is a bit tongue-in-cheek just because if you make it so easy to add functionality, I do feel like there's a risk of bloating your application. I just go to that page that I showed a couple minutes ago and suddenly I have 9 libraries installed in my app that I didn't even need to start with because it's too easy. So use it with caution and obviously check the remote scripts you're executing, but it really is that simple. Bloat needs to be installed and then you run it. So let's dive into a little bit of this code. I'm going to go over it just very briefly so that you know what it does and can get an idea for what Thor does behind the scenes. So first we install the Tailwind CSS package. Then we set up the configuration file that Tailwind CSS needs to know what it needs to watch when it runs purge CSS, any other theme additions or things like that. And then in lines 30 through 41, we're extending our Laravel mix config file. And yes, I did say Laravel mix because Lucky also builds on the shoulders of giants, and it doesn't have to just be in the context of Ruby. When Paul Smith was creating the Lucky framework, there was certainly an option to build a Webpack wrapper from the ground up, kind of like what Rails did with Webpacker. But instead, Laravel Mix already existed. It was well supported and easy to use. So Paul ported it into Lucky, and we use it as a package, and it works great. So we add Tailwind CSS functionality there, which is already documented on the Tailwind CSS website. And then we import the CSS. And the nice thing about these being Ruby scripts is you can extract methods to hide functionality and make it even easier to read through in the future and remember how you do things in what order. So here are the two methods I extracted. The first is one that I include in pretty much every Rails byte I create. It's a yarn method that takes any number of packages and installs them. And then the second one is just a little method that hides away this large here doc where I'm initializing Tailwind with that config file. So here I am starting from zero. I'm just in my repos folder. No funny business, I promise. I have no Lucky app created at all. And before, just for context, installing Tailwind CSS, I spent a full afternoon on it. I was working on other things, so it's hard I didn't time it exactly, but it certainly took me on the gauge of 1 to 2 hours to get Tailwind working. And even then, I think I had to tweak it in the future. So let's see how long it takes me to get Tailwind going from scratch. So first, I'm just initializing a Lucky app. And then I'm going to install the dependencies that Lucky needs by default. No Tailwind CSS included here. This is just what it comes with out of the box. So Laravel mix and Sass and normalized CSS, some of that good stuff. So now I'm going to run the bloat command to install Tailwind CSS. It adds the package, installs it, modifies some files, and I'm done. Now if I boot my Lucky server, which this is a video, so I can't do, but I would have Tailwind CSS out of the box, ready to go, under 30 seconds. And that is exactly the experience that I was looking for when I was coming to the framework for the first time. And what I really believe a lot of people are looking for. You want to be able to come into this house that is Lucky and make it feel like your home. Bring your own furniture and bring the stuff that you're comfortable with so that you can move quickly and be familiar with what you're producing while also experiencing only the newness that Lucky brings and the new concepts and speed that it brings to you. To be clear, though, the point of this talk is not to say that we should never make something new or that we should only use existing solutions. For example, another thing that I found really difficult was upgrading Lucky apps. I almost always miss something in the release notes, and I really wanted the experience that I had previously with railsdiff.org. For any of you who aren't familiar with it, it just looks like this. You select a source version and a target version, and then it gives you a diff so that you know exactly what you need to change in a newly generated app. Well, when I looked into the source code, it was an Ember app, which I kind of knew how to use and I could definitely have forked and made Lucky Diff from. But it did admittedly feel a little bit weird writing a diff tool for Lucky releases that was online that wasn't using Lucky. So I did build it using Lucky from scratch, but I emulated everything that Rails diff did. And I tried to stay true to how they had architected the application initially, still building on the shoulders of the giant that had come before me and not spending all of my time thinking about these grand ideas of how I could do it with Git diffs and comparisons that I'm sure I would have ran down the rabbit hole of and happily done for weeks. This tool has been a game changer for me personally, and also I think for our community. And thanks to Rails diff and being able to lean on their ideas and code, I was able to get it up and running in production in a few days so that people could use it. And one other one other interesting aspect of this. So obviously I have the bloat gem and I've been using that really successfully. And at the time I submitted this talk, I had not reinvented the wheel. Well, since then, I did start an attempt at reinventing the wheel with kind of rewriting Thor and TTY, two popular Ruby gems, in a crystal shard. But again, it wasn't because I needed output from it. I already have a productive way to install things in my app. Now I'm using those libraries so that I can learn how it works in Crystal. I'm building on the shoulders of giants in a very different way, but in an interesting way. And if you're interested in contributing to that or opening issues or looking at what I built so far, it's at stephendolan.com/spark on GitHub. Great. Well, if you want to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter at Stephen_Dolan. I'm on GitHub, like I just said, at Stephen Dolan. If you're looking for a web framework that you can use to develop your applications, I think you'll find no surprise that I would really recommend Lucky. It's a great community, lots of great people there. If you are concerned about whether it would be a fit for you or you're nervous about making the jump from something else in another language or framework, then go to that website, hit the chat button in the nav bar, and the whole core team is there to help out. We'll answer any questions, walk you through code samples, really whatever you need to feel comfortable. And if you're already using Lucky and you want some more resources, I have luckycast.com. There's a lot of free content. There's a little bit of premium content, so you can support me if you want to. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the time. And I think my timer says that I've done enough to maybe have some time for Q&A, so we'll see.
Yes, you have. That was a great talk, by the way. There's a lot of love coming through the chat also. People have loved your talk. They're saying that they highly recommend LuckyCast as well. So you're you're
thanks,
doing
guys.
pretty well. And we have a question from Kevin. He says he'd love to pair on Spark sometime.
Yeah, well,
that's really a question.
Hey, it's on GitHub. So if you want to open an issue for any functionality that you think might be good, or submit a PR, I'm always happy to review those. But yeah, we do have a pairing room in the Lucky Discord. So hop in there, and I'd be happy to hop on with anyone who's enjoyed the talk and wants to check out what I'm building.
So I'm kind of curious, how did you come up with the concept of reusing things, and how at the time did you think it was possible to cleanly transport things that were solved in the Ruby community to the Crystal community, or how did you figure that out?
Yeah, I did admittedly kind of gloss over that epiphany moment of, I decided not to do it after I had spun up some repositories. But realistically, I was chatting some people in the Lucky Discord asking, how possible would it be to execute this code kind of dynamically? And people were saying it would be really difficult because it's compiled to run a script at runtime and do this apply thing that Thor can do. It might be really difficult. So I immediately just started thinking, well, could I just use Ruby? It's not ideal because I'd love people to just be able to stay in Crystal and not have to install, Go and Rust and Ruby and all these other dependencies just to use a language or framework written in Crystal. But I thought it was a great first step, and it just seemed hard at the time. But for the record, I have gotten that working in Spark. So you can apply templates from a URL currently in that shard. I can't say it's safe, but it works.
Okay, Kevin has a second question. He says, have you thought about implementing a dry run option to Spark, allow you to see what happens without actually performing the actions?
No, but now I have. That's a great idea. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, so Jonathan says, what can I buy or donate to get a sweet Lucky t-shirt?
Oh, great. Yeah, I don't know if my mic's in the way. I can show it off for a second. There we go. Yeah, actually, you don't have to buy or donate anything except for your time. We give away these shirts to contributors. So if you open enough PRs and you're active in the community, or either or, then you might find a shirt arriving at your doorstep. And I think there's a little section in our contributing guide on the repo too for how to get a t-shirt.
All right, great. So Vlad is asking, now that the Crystal Eye is on the horizon, will you reconsider?
Yeah, I'm kicking myself because I was prepping, because I had 2 talks today. I was like prepping like mad beforehand, and I didn't actually see that talk. So I'm going to be biting my nails waiting for that interactive Crystal talk to come out. I know it's going to be a game changer. I don't know enough yet to know whether it's going to change whether Spark or other things like that will be necessary or not. I'm not sure.
Okay. Do we have any last ones? Any takers? Okay. It looks like everyone's been happy with your talk. Happily enough, not to have any more questions or doubts, but if any one of those comes later, as people often are recurrent years later, they can find you on Discord, and where else?
Yeah, on Twitter at Steven_Dolan. And obviously, if you want to hear me talk more, I post videos on luckycast.com. So I'll be there.